tonight we have another wonderful webinar by Eddy Cartaya and Brent McGregor, and it is the Sandy Glacier Cave Project. I want to thank our sponsor, NSS, who our parent organization, who without them, we wouldn't have this webinar. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, Edwards Aquifer Authority in San Antonio, Virginia Karstland, and Geigerig. While we are having the webinar, everybody will be muted so that we have a good recording. If you have a question or concern, technical problem, please use your chat bar to type it. And if there are any technical difficulties, just let me know. But tonight I'm going to introduce our speakers. First I'm going to introduce Eddy. Eddy is currently employed as a law enforcement officer with the U.S. Forest Service in Bend, Oregon. And what he does is he spends his time patrolling caves and solving cave-related crimes. He's also the team leader for the Deschutes County Cave Rescue section of the Mountain Rescue Team. And he's, excuse me, recently assumed the role of the Pacific Northwest NCRC Coordinator. He's currently a member of the Oregon High Desert Grotto, and he's worked with Brent in conducting numerous studies on major expeditions in the region's glacier cave system. That also includes Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens. And Brent is currently the chairman of the High Grotto, Oregon High Grotto Desert. I'm really mangling that. Oregon High Desert Grotto. He combines his skills in photography, mountaineering, and caving. He has spent the last several years caving with his partner, Eddy, exploring and documenting glacier and ice caves. He's a project, they're project-driven, and they've begun mapping a newly discovered glacier cave up in the ice region, up in Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier. And these two have been performing several studies on ice caves found in lava tubes scattered throughout the U.S. When I first heard about these two, I was watching a TED Talk when I was down in Texas, and it was amazing. I was really blown away by his talk. And TED Talks, if you don't know what those are, they're very high-end presentations that are given internationally. They're just amazing. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Brent and Eddy and let them go ahead and talk. It's an amazing information what they have. All right, Brent and Eddy, are you there?
Yes. Yeah, we're here.
Wonderful. All right, guys, the show's all yours.
Well, thanks, Debbie. This is Brent McGregor. I'm going to start out here. And first of all, we want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. We're going to try to cover a lot of the work we've been doing up on the Sandy Glacier for the last 5 years. We've been seeing a lot of change up there, which is pretty interesting. So first of all, the terms glacier cave and ice cave are often misused, or they're used for the wrong application. And we wanted to first kind of talk about that and clear up one from the other. A glacier cave is a cave that's actually formed inside of a glacier. That said, it usually has a walls and ceiling made of the glacier ice. It can have a bedrock floor. Whereas an ice cave, in the case of Oregon where we live, most of our ice caves are in lava tubes, which are rock, and there's perennial ice within the lava tube. Such you see here, the walls and the ceiling are made of rock with an ice floor. Another example, a cave in Idaho, some hoarfrost ice crystals on the ceiling with an ice floor inside of a lava tube. So the terminology can be mistaken back and forth.
So this is Eddy Cartaya here now. So we're going to go over a little bit about how glacier caves form in the first place. And there's actually three processes working in concert with each other to do that, being water, air, and plastic deformation. So the first is actually water. All glacier caves start with the introduction of water from the internal aquifer of the glacier as it is gravity fed and forces its way out through little fissures and cracks until it eventually finds the toe of the glacier, frequently by way of a contact with the bedrock like you see here. This is actually water flowing out of the toe of the Sandy Glacier. And you can see here how much water actually comes out. It's looking up tube, up towards the summit of Mount Hood, and how much water is actually coming down. All that's either surface meltwater or internal aquifer fed by lots of little tubes into a large stream, and it's thundering how much water comes out that way. The second process is air. Warm air coming up from the lower parts of the mountain gets into the toe of the glacier, the actual entrance of the cave, and it flows uphill. And you'll see in the roof of this passage, in pure imagination, scalloping features along the walls and the ceilings, and that's indicative of a melting process by warm air. It's kind of like sun cups in snow facing the other way, but it makes little cups of melted areas, and it percolates down, drips through the little peaks between the sun cups, and hits down to the water. And that makes the passage much, much bigger than the water itself could have ever done. It's actually the most aggressive glacier cave formation process that we see. Again, you see here some of the water flowing over, actually one of the lava flows from Mount Hood that's been covered by the glacier for thousands of years. And one of our surveyors there, actually trying to get across this was fun. The third process is plastic deformation. The glacier, remember the caves themselves are moving. Unlike a rock cave, the walls, the ceilings, it's part of a river of ice that actually flows downhill. And not just downhill, but sometimes obliquely to the fall line. And you can get these twists and turns in the cave. What you see here is one of the moulins, the vertical passages. It's, a year before this photo, it was straight up and down, a nice tubular vertical conduit. You can see now it's kind of twisted like a tornado, and that's from the glacier flowing to the left and away from the viewer, obliquely across the hill, and that's making the opening much, much bigger. So all three of those work together to make these passages bigger and very dynamic and interesting. The last process that's in some other types of glacier caves, like on St. Helens and Mount Rainier, is geothermal. These are on active volcanoes. Mount Hood is as well. And you have steam vents at the contact of the bedrock and the glacier floor, and steam rises, obviously. So it melts its way up high and forms these tall cathedral-like rooms, which eventually get out to the surface. It actually forms its entrances from the bottom up, as opposed to water, which forms it from the top down. And what's classic in these types of passages are narrow, very tall passages, like you see here, formed by steam coming out of the rocks and actual little active vents. And this last image here is from inside Mount St. Helens, one of the new glacier caves. Lots of processes working in concert. You've got steam vents going up. The circles in the walls are waterfalls coming out. And you see ice on the floor from plastic deformation actually breaking the cave apart. So that's a little bit of how glacier caves themselves form. This last image is on the summit of Mount Rainier inside the complex cave passages there. This is actually a meltwater pool over 130 feet long, again from meltwater from air hitting the ceiling and dripping down into a catch basin in the passage there.
So we started our explorations on Mount Hood in 2011. We had seen a YouTube video that showed a large glacier cave passage on the Sandy Glacier. We're looking at the Sandy Glacier in this image with the summit of Mount Hood behind it. The day we went up and spent the first night, the day we went up there, the mountain was pretty well fogged in and we had no visibility. We didn't have a GPS location of the cave. These two had posted the YouTube video, and they sent us this image. And in the image, you can see, circled in red, the entrance to Snow Dragon Cave. So we had this with us, but we didn't have a visual on the cave. And when we got there earlier in the spring, the only sign of any kind of a hole in the glacier was this kind of a narrow crevasse-like feature. So in the morning, with Scott Lynn, the three of us, we rappelled down into this crevasse, and after walking about 75 feet through a narrow passageway, we came into this massive borehole. And for reference, you can see here circled in red, a picture of Eddy getting some water out of the creek. These rival, the size of this rivals our largest lava tubes in Oregon. It's very big passageways. So we walked up to the upper terminus and began surveying our way back to the entrance. So we surveyed the main Glacier Cave passage that day, but we didn't go down lower than the entrance until a month later when Eddy and I returned with wetsuits, 500 feet of rope, pickets, ice screws, a lot of equipment to go into a very wet, adventurous passage to continue surveying the rest of the cave. This is where we ended because we ran out of rope. The Glacier Cave is open, exposed here because of a waterfall. Wherever there's big waterfall breaks in the river, the cave seems to melt away faster in the lower fern sections. And our disto died, right. We got everything wet. 2.5 months later, I went up to the glacier to do some photo documentation to try to show what was happening. Was the caves getting bigger, smaller, receding up the mountain, or growing longer? And in that day I was up there, I noticed I found this new cave, which was near to Snow Dragon Cave. It was much smaller. You can see the opening was only about 8 feet high, and you can see off, if this mouse pointer works, there's holes out kind of going crossways through the glacier here. There was what we called the mouse maze. There was a lot of smaller passageways connecting through there, which had this beautiful blue ice in the ceiling, which is indicative of a very thin ceiling, which isn't always particularly good to go around because they cave in a lot. So besides the mouse maze area, I found this giant borehole going straight up the glacier, very similar to Snow Dragon Cave. And I followed it up until I came to this rock wall, which is actually a very old...
It's a lava flow from Mount Hood over 1,000 years back.
Yeah, and I decided not to go any further by myself. Wasn't sure what was up there. I was getting too far in. Nobody even knew the cave existed or knew I was in there. So Eddy and I came back 22 days later, and we had all the equipment we needed to fully explore the rest of the cave. Since there was a strong airflow coming through the cave, different than Snow Dragon, we had the idea that there's got to be an opening up above. And I imagine there was a crevasse that it ended in, a crevasse on the upper glacier. We were very surprised to find this mullen, this giant vertical borehole. A mullen is basically a vertical hole dropped through the glacier. There's surface water running down the glacier. It finds a fracture, a crack, a weakness in the surface of the glacier, works its way down to the bedrock floor, and in the process, the warmer water, warmer than the ice, continues to enlarge that hole, and once the airflow starts through there, it expands and gets bigger and bigger. So on our discovery, the hole was probably about 20, 25 feet across. It's just beautiful, beautiful ice. We were very excited. Neither of us had seen anything like this in the Pacific Northwest. It was very unique for our area.
That's about 120 feet or so?
Yeah.
Vertical, straight up, yeah.
So we rappelled off of this boulder to get down. We used a pull down. You can see the knot there where we connected 2 ropes so we could pull the rope after we got down the steep section. And we wanted to hurry and go to outside of the glacier and climb up and try to locate where the top of the mullen was. It was getting near sunset, near dark, but we really wanted to get a waypoint for that, so our next trip we would have a fix on it. 2 months later, we came back to the caves. We had to use 4-wheel drive with chains, a snow machine, snowshoes, crampons. We had a lot of gear to get into there. It was very winter-like that winter of 2012. And we spent a night. This is Snow Dragon Cave. You can see it's nearly sealed shut. That big, massive opening was nearly completely closed. And when we got inside, you can see how the spindrift from the glacier had just come down and continually built up to where it built this wall sealing the entrance. You can also see our camp to the left, where we camped just inside the cave because there was quite a storm blowing outside that night. Everything was very cold and frozen. Everything around the rocks, the water seeps from the mullens were freezing into frozen waterfalls. It was just fantastic visually. As a photographer, I was going crazy. So the morning we came up, we had to pull our rope out of the, it froze in from the storm that night before. We broke it loose and got up to the top. Our goal was to go up to the top of Pure Imagination Cave to service Mullen, was what we named it, and we were going to do the first rappel down through the Mullen. So this is one of the first photographs showing dropping down through the Mullen, and you can see those big pillows of snow overhead where the surface snow was starting to seal the Mullen shut, and it was just basically a narrow slit at that time. So again, we were lucky to get in there before it did seal shut. We dropped down as far as we had rope for, which left us about another 50 feet to the bottom. So we put in an ice screw anchor, and we took all our webbing and whatever we had in our packs to build enough to get down to the bottom. And what we found at the bedrock floor was this avalanche debris that had, from the surface of the glacier had come down through the Mullen hole and deposited these big blocks of ice at the bottom there, which was very interesting. We hadn't seen anything like that before. So here's a picture of Eddy as we're heading back up out.
So after this last trip and seeing these two large caves, we knew we had a significant resource, and we wanted to go ahead and let the Forest Service, Mount Hood National Forest, be aware of it, and also propose a lengthy expedition to map what we anticipate would be a total of 3 systems: Pure Imagination, Snow Dragon, and then we had found a water lead to a third tube that we felt was pretty promising. So we did on January 10th. Myself, Brent, we brought our geologist from the Deschutes National Forest, Bart Wills, and we did a presentation to pretty much everyone with an ologist name in their title. And they were very excited about it. However, they told us they had really no one in their staff trained or willing or able to conduct this study. But what they did do is grant us a research permit so that we could do it ourselves, which included some wilderness waivers for numbers of people in the wilderness area. So we were excited to go ahead and get that. And so in July 6 through 14 was the first Sandy Glacier Cave expedition. Now, this is a massive undertaking to get a base camp up to this area. I believe we transported a total of 1,500 pounds of gear because we have to have our own field hospital, our own ability to rescue, communications, ropes, rigging, dive gear, you name it, we had to have it all up there. So we went in 2 waves. Brent led the lead wave on Friday, moving a lot of the gear in to the camp, trying to locate the caves which were still buried and get our water sources and our initial camp established. The following day, I led the second wave, which is the main body of the expedition. Most of the researchers and a whole lot of Sherpas from all kinds of grottos and mountaineering clubs, even an outdoor Boy Scout outdoor adventure group, and moving tons of gear up the mountain to our camp, which we dubbed Camp Tenacious. Here you see the welcome sign at the entrance to the camp and some of our sponsors and supporters and Sherpa helpers. They're listed on the placard. So again, just a magnificent and magical place to go caving and to lead a caving expedition. This is our base camp, and you see in the background Northern Lights that came out just for a few short minutes. So Brent and I stayed up late trying to capture all this. Just, again, breathtaking views. You actually never really wanted to go to sleep, even though you were completely exhausted. On, I think, the 3rd or 4th day in was our day that we pushed the wet lead. And here's a little snapshot right before we all went in. You can see some of the air tanks and masks and different dry suits and things for a very wet push into what we hoped would be a 3rd major cave system. We also did have some science contingency up there with us. This is Gunnar Johnson from Portland State University. He specializes in extremophile studies and water quality. Took a lot of readings for us, which we ended up adding to our papers that we did subsequently to this. And Robert McGowan, he's a contract researcher for NASA, does a lot of different kinds of projects. You see him here hammering in some stakes into the ice walls. We surveyed from bedrock to these stakes so we could try to track the movement of the ice itself, the cave itself, traveling downhill, which is kind of a novel topic in caving. And then Bart Wills doing some rock collections on behalf of the U.S. Geologic Survey. They were also very interested in this lava flow and some specimens because these are basically been entombed in ice for hundreds of years. In the yellow there in the middle there is Scott Lynn. He was our expedition survey leader, and some one of our other survey team folks there, Jeff, Chris, and Jed Medden. And there's myself, again in wetsuits for some of these wetter parts in one of our survey stations. And we also did a surface survey. The glaciologists were interested in how much ice was over the tops of these caves. So in addition to surveying underground, we just ran the survey right back up the entrance and along the surface. We had to kind of extrapolate where the passage was relating to the surface and run the survey line across. And so our maps, as you'll see, they'll actually depict in true scale how much ice is over each cave. So what you see here, our Matt Skeels, our grotto cartographer, crunched all this data and put together a system-wide map, a total of 7,166 feet. You'll see Frozen Minotaur on the left, Snow Dragon middle, Pure Imagination right, and how they all tie in hydrologically there. Those dotted lines you see across the middle of the map indicate where the glacier ice pretty much stops and firn ice begins, which is a metamorphic form of snow, very, very hard, compact. Some of it stays all year and other parts of it melt away and expose different parts of the lower half of the cave system. The individual caves themselves also got their own maps. So you see Snow Dragon Cave here, the entrance shown. Everything below the entrance is part of the Fern Passage, which is very, very wet and sporty. That's the dry suit, wetsuit areas of the survey. And Pure Imagination, and you can see the Cerebus Moulin about 2/3 of the way up to the right there, showing the shaft that you saw the pictures of earlier in the presentation. So we got some really nice data from this. On that fourth day, this is us approaching the wet lead, which ended up becoming Frozen Minotaur Cave. We hardly have any photos of the lead itself because we were basically underwater for most of it. But this is showing the approach to the area. This is over the Fern Passage. While we entered this part, we had to drag telephone wires tied to our feet as well as belay ropes. So when we got in there, we could communicate with our out party by way of cricket phones, commonly used in cave rescue. The only form of communication we had. So it was kind of a complex crawl. And this is the last image of Brent and I right before we went in. You see, we're wearing wetsuits underneath our cave suits. So of humorous note, during the crawl, Brent's cave suit, or his wetsuit, which zippers in the back, actually broke open, and he was basically power washed or filled with water, inflated like a balloon. And the water here is about 32.1 degrees. So you can imagine the reaction to being immersed in that kind of temperature water. But it was a successful push. We were able to come back and survey it, and this became Frozen Minotaur Cave, the third arm of the cave system. Different from the others in that it had lots of different arms and channels, not just one straight tube. So it was a very exciting and a unique addition to the overall Sandy Glacier Cave system itself.
So as a result of this expedition, we had some publications out. The NSS News of February 2013 published an article with a lot of photographs and a long description of our explorations there. Beneath the Forest is a Forest Service publication that ran an article about our work there. And Professional Surveyor Magazine did a story on how you get a group to go underneath a glacier to actually survey and map 7,000 feet of passage. They did a good job on an article for us. This all brought us more notoriety to where our local TV station in Oregon, Oregon Public Broadcast, contacted us, interested in doing a multimedia presentation, one of their larger presentations they had done about our work up there. So a year later, 12 months later, 2013 was our second expedition. So here's Eddy leading a group back in. We had cameras in our faces a lot. Usually I'm shooting everybody, but this is a switch because they were photographing me. Our camp, back at Camp Tenacious again. We were on a low budget, so somebody volunteered as experimental aircraft to fly over, and a photographer. They got aerial photos of the camp and Mount Hood behind the camp for part of the show. Here's a picture of me following Eddy's lead up the glacier wall to a hole in the wall about 30 feet up. We were checking for a new lead. we want to check all the leads we can find in case they go into new glacier passages. Remember this shot because we're going to reference back to this in a few slides up here. We use fixed lines on some of the steeper areas in the caves where people were going back and forth daily. These are fixed to the line with ice screws so people can clip in with their harness and safely go up and down. We also found a new mullen being formed, which is up glacier in Pure Imagination Cave. It was up glacier from the Cerebus mullen, the big original mullen that we had found. And this was interesting because we weren't able to see daylight through it to the top yet. It was just very new in its infancy, but we knew that this was going to continue to grow and eventually be large enough for a human to pass all the way through. We also had the benefit of Dr. Andrew Fountain from PSU, a glaciologist who's studied glaciers around the world. He came up for a day and he went into the glacier, into the caves, and took a look at them and gave us a lot of his ideas on what was going on, basically saying that the size of these large caves was indicative of the fact that the glacier is dying. And because there's less glacier mass, it's allowing these bigger caves to stay intact. And he just sat around and talked to the whole group about a lot of his points on glaciers, which was very interesting. He also recommended that we monitor the melt of the surface of the glaciers, the snow on top of the glacier ice. So every day we took measurements to see how much it was melting away every day. The other thing of interest was what lives up in the glacier, what lives in the glacier caves. It's very curious to find what kind of animals can live in that kind of environment. The grilloblatas, hope I said that right, commonly known as a rock crawler and ice crawler. We did not find these in the caves, but they were in the snow around the surface of the cave, around camp, and they would come out in the evenings and crawl along the ice. But we collected a few to send to the scientists we're working with. We also found several of these beetles that would come out at night and feed on something on the snow surface. But inside the cave there were these midges, not a lot, but they were scattered through the caves, and they lived on the glacier walls. And they were eating something off of the glacier walls, evidently. And these have been seen in other glacier caves around the world. But I find it interesting that they would choose that environment to live in. At the end of Snow Dragon Cave, the upper end, there is no upper entrance or exit. It dead ends. And we'd found this feather right near the end of the cave that had been, obviously it had been melted or frozen into the wall of the cave for possibly 100 years or more. And as the cave is growing larger and larger, things like this feather were coming out of the wall. They were melting out. We found several curiosities. And this was analyzed to be found to be a mallard duck feather.
And so this is a boitroidal agate, also found very close to the duck feather near the back of the cave. There was a lot of interesting mineralogical specimens brought out of there. One, like Brent was saying, it's a peculiar process. The glacier cave is like a time capsule in that things land on the surface of the ice, like leaves, seeds, feathers, get buried by snow, become part of the glacier, and work their way down deeper and deeper into the ice. And then as the cave melts, they basically fall or rain down onto the cave floor. And we're just lucky to be there just in time to pick those up because they get washed away in short order.
Some people were better at finding little things than others. Neil Marchington has a real eye for small insects and invertebrates, but everybody was seeing these seedlings on the expedition in all of the caves. They're finding these seedlings that we had analyzed, and they were found to be noble fir. And they were melting out of the walls, and you can see here that's a live sprout. The thing was trying to grow in total darkness back in the recess of the cave, and they would grow these tails and then eventually die out. There was no light to live in. But some of them, like the lower left picture here, where they were near a skylight or the cave entrance, they actually continued to grow. The other thing that came out of the second expedition was a new survey map of the upper part of Pure Imagination Cave. So what we're looking at here is a Cerebus mullen, the old mullen that we had originally found, and this was the new moulin, which was forming.
And one thing I'm going to chime in here, this is basically a 5-year study, and what we do is each year we go back and repeat these surveys, which for two reasons. A, the caves are changing. They're not just moving downhill. They're forming new passages, new water courses, new waterfalls. But it allows us to calculate a volume of the cave itself. And if you compare the volumes year after year, you'll obviously see they're getting larger because the caves are getting bigger. And that allows us to do a volumetric comparison, calculate how much ice is actually melting in the course of each year, and subsequently how much water is being deposited into the watershed. Basically, it's a way of studying glacier recession from inside the glacier. From the outside, you can't really tell much is happening, but by measuring the net ice lost, or the ablation of the cave walls and ceiling, it gives us a lot more data than you could ever possibly get from surface observations.
I really don't know where the term
ablation?
No, slow as a glacier.
Oh, slow as a glacier. Yeah, things change super fast.
Every time we go see the glacier and we're heading out, the whole trip hiking out is talking about what we're going to see next time, because it's like going to a new cave every trip. There's so many new features happening, and the old features are gone. So, finishing up the second expedition, here's some of the photographs that I took showing the ice is so beautiful to photograph because it's so reflective and translucent, and with the sun setting down to the west, it's coming through the ice in a lot of these pictures and just making some fantastic views. This is the moulin up above with Eddy going down. Just a lot of times we would go into the cave to do our work at night because there's less hazards with rock and icefall. The lower passage of pure imagination with the blue ice, the see-through ice. This photograph was the entrance to Snow Dragon Cave was lit up with high-powered lights to really show what it looks like inside there, as well as being able to see up towards the top of Mount Hood and the stars at night. You can actually see everything down inside the cave there. And the sun's just setting down over the town of Portland out near the horizon in the entrance to Snow Dragon Cave. So I was talking earlier about when we climbed the wall to push the lead up on the wall. You can see my pointer here. That was right up here, and the lead was up in here somewhere. And just 2 months later, that whole area had melted out and formed a skylight. And it wasn't long before this whole column near the entrance had collapsed. You can see these blocks of ice through here that had freshly caved in from this area. Things are continually moving.
So after the second expedition that year, OPB put together a 30-minute special for Oregon Field Guide, which is a show they do. Normally they do it in 15-minute segments. They gave us a 30-minute special segment. And it premiered into Hollywood Theater here in downtown Portland. We were expecting, 40, 50 folks to show up because it was a pretty small interest crowd, but we were quite surprised to pack the entire theater out, 300-plus folks, with all kinds of various disciplines in science and recreational interest shown in the project. After the premiere of it, myself, Brent, and Dr. Fountain, you see there in blue in the center, were brought up for questions and answers, and I guess got a really enthusiastic response from the crowd. And not only for us, this ended up being a major success story for OPB themselves. They won a ton of awards through this show, the Northwest Regional Emmy Award, the National Edward R. Murrow Award, amongst a host of others. And those are very prestigious things to win in journalism. It's something you rarely get to have. This represents the whole crew of OPB there. And Brent helped me out. Amelia Templeton's over the radio component of it. Talking out loud.
I believe Katie Campbell was with EarthFix.
Okay.
And, of course, on the right, Steve Amon has hosted Oregon Field Guide since its beginning, I believe. I've watched him for over 20 years on Oregon Field Guide.
And then Ed Yon there on the second from the left was our main producer for the show.
And don't forget Andy. He was one of their lead photographers.
Yeah. Had him dangling in the ice and on ropes for a lot of this. He's getting showered by ice water. So yeah, very successful, and it was neat to see that our project, spawned this kind of reaction. Very shortly after that, we were contacted by TED Talks, which I hadn't really been very familiar with, but they requested that we do a live presentation in New Orleans of November of that year, specifically targeting their youth audiences. So Brent made a presentation. They flew me out there, and we went ahead and delivered the presentation. You can see the number of links there. At this time, it was over 500,000 total views. I don't know what it is nowadays, but it was translated into a bunch of different languages, delivered live. Really exciting presentation. And during the breaks and at the end of the show, they had us set up these interactive desktop presentations so that kids and other members of the audience could come there and put their hands not just on caving gear, but on gear particular to glacier caving, which included the crampons, the ice screws, some of the unique tools and bags that we used for those kinds of expeditions. So here you see one of the kids trying on one of our helmets and some of the vertical gear hanging from the rafters there in the background. Then another thing that happened in short order was an invitation to the International Workshop on Ice Caves. This is a special seminar held every 2 years, typically in Europe or in Slavic countries, and it was brought to the U.S. for the first time in 2014 and hosted in Idaho Falls. And so international scientists from all over the place. I think how many? 11 countries?
I believe 11
Brent?
countries, yeah.
11 countries, and a bunch of folks from the U.S. showed up to this. Brent and I wrote a science paper to deliver for this project. Actually got it published in their journal, and one of the conditions is we briefed it to the entire conference. Here you see us in the middle of the briefing itself, and here's one of the slides Brent created. Again, this is a host of scientists, so they're interested in what we learned, our findings, and what our future studies were. And we got a lot of subsequent cooperation from this. The after-hours presentations, they actually requested that we show the OPD video and do some questions and answer afterwards. We actually brought some of our mineral specimens and maps and different things that we had collected during the course of our expedition there.
So that takes us to what did we actually see happen on the glacier? As a photographer, I wished I would have had the foresight to realize what was happening at the time. The first few years it really didn't sink in because glacier caves were new to us. We were used to lava tubes, which we have plenty of in Oregon. But the unfamiliarity, I didn't realize that this was going to change so quickly. And I wish I would have set up certain photo points for every cave entrance so it would be very easy to see the difference year to year. As it is, we're going to go through and show you year by year how these have changed, and some of them are going to be a little difficult to see until you get towards the end. Well, this, of course, was our first trip in to Snow Dragon Cave through this crevasse-looking opening. A year later, you can see near the fall when the maximum melt out, you can see how large this has melted out here. There's still this little fern section down below, which was kind of stubborn. It stayed on there for a couple years till it finally melted completely away. And in the image, if you look over here, is where Pure Imagination Cave is located. So 2012, another image from 2012 showing what you're going to see. You may not see a lot of recession in the next year, but you're going to see the passage widen out through here. So 2013, it's getting larger. You can see a person in there for scale. And 2014 was when we really saw a lot of change happening very quickly. This was a shot when Eddy went up with a group, and back in Snow Dragon a ways, one of the skylight completely collapsed from wall to wall, creating this giant, large opening, which basically cut the cave in half. Eddy?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in on a couple of cave hazards that are peculiar to Glacier Cave. Remember, the cave itself is moving. So imagine, a cave, but the walls and the ceiling are actually traveling over you, not at a speed you can detect. But you see here an example. Brent's going to point it out with his cursor, an area of delamination. You see a large crack there. Warm air gets back into there and actually melts giant slabs off from the inside out. All that rubble you see in the floor is delamination collapse. And you definitely don't want to stand anywhere near or around that, even though it's very inviting because it's beautiful ice. Also, you see some rocks embedded in the ceiling here. Let me see if I can get this to work. You see some rocks, small ones, big ones, here. The ambient air of the cave is about 40 degrees. It actually heats the rocks and helps them melt out of the ice, even though the ice itself is freezing or a little below. And you can see some of the layers of accumulation here, these lines showing. These are all weak spots that can subsequently break. So again, just some unique hazards to this cave in addition to the usual ones you're acclimatized to.
Yeah, I've made probably 25 trips up there, and some days when you walk up to the entrance of Snow Dragon Cave in the summer, if you just sit there for 5 minutes, you'll hear these huge booms, crashes, and it's tons of ice falling off the walls back in. And if you just pay attention and hear that, well, that's a day you're not going to go in there. You'll just avoid the cave. And sometimes pure imagination would be solid and much safer, or vice versa, just depending on the situation. So the red circle shows you that collapse in the previous picture with the entrance to Snow Dragon Cave right here, and pure imagination, the entrance is here. If you go up, this is all glacier. It's covered with debris, but this is all glacier. And here is the service Moulin, clear up here. So here is the track of pure imagination, and Snow Dragon is basically doing the same thing, paralleling up towards the upper part of the glacier. Less than a month after Eddy went up, I took this photo. Again, here is the opening to Snow Dragon Cave, but this is the collapse, skylight collapse that Eddy had photographed in his previous picture. And in less than a month, we had another one of these appear. It was just mind-boggling that it was going away so fast. And besides these two, Eddy had found one further up at the upper end of the cave. So it's just falling apart very quickly in 2014. This was just taken a couple weeks ago, January 31st, and very much to my surprise, between the two skylights in Snow Dragon Cave that we just looked at the previous slide, we had a total collapse of at least 100, maybe 200 feet of cave passage. From wall to wall, the whole ceiling just fell in. And we weren't really expecting that. I thought in my mind it may take 5 years before we see things like that. And so the caves are going away very fast. Here's a picture looking at the collapse closer up. And this is what it looks like inside. There were some beautiful big chunks of deep blue ice. It was beautiful, but yet very sad to see this happening. Another shot showing just caving in and turning in, like Professor Andrew Fountain said, it's going to turn into a slot canyon type feature on the glacier. So Pure Imagination Cave, here is my very first photograph of it in 2011. You can see it's small, not a large cave. You wouldn't particularly take notice of it or think it would really go anywhere. A year later, it's the front of the cave is falling apart and it's cutting back into the deeper ice. The entrance is getting larger. There's more airflow. It's working its way back up glacier, so the entrance is getting bigger year by year and getting comparable to the size of Snow Dragon. This was taken just a couple weeks ago, the entrance of Pure Imagination. Look how wide it has become. It's just amazing to see this happen. It's just changing so fast. Glacial speed is what I was thinking of. This is if this is, you know, our lava tubes are glacial speed, and the ice caves are like an ice cube in water. We're looking at the same image just from the inside looking out, and what this shows, this bridge, this entrance bridge, this is going to collapse this year. I'll bet on that. And this whole entrance will work its way back further up the glacier. You can see here this frozen column from a Moulin hole in the ceiling. These are what we're seeing are opening up these skylights. Wherever there's a fracture in the glacier and the water finds its way through and creates these holes, they get bigger and bigger until they're just segmenting the caves apart and collapsing them. Very interesting, but very sad. Let's look at the Mullen now. This is our first shot of the surface of the Mullen, 2011, November. 2 years later, look how much larger it is. It's really, really growing large. And the sun's coming in from this direction, so the sun is really hitting this side, making this really grow out here and less on this side.
This is an example where we used a survey. We did 2 subsequent surveys of this in 2012, one in 2013, and did a volumetric comparison, and we were able to calculate this was over a 400% size increase in the passage, and we were actually able to calculate, a tonnage of ice that was melted out or lost just from this one specific feature, and primarily due to air convection coming up through it.
And that's the importance of our continued surveys year after year is building up this data, which a lot of your glaciologists are studying the glaciers from the surface, but not from beneath the surface. So it's an interesting concept in giving kind of new numbers. Looking at the Mullen from the bottom up, our first photograph of the Mullen, November 2011, just about a year later, you can see how much it's growing in size. And today, basically today, look at the size of that hole now. This is a group of Mazamas that were there when I was there, and they're climbing up out of the Mullen. This image shows you some ceiling delamination, but if you see this big fresh snowfall here, this is coming out of the Service Mullen from the recent storms this year, and so this icefall here is up passage from the Mullen, which was always fairly stable before, but as you see on this map, this area here is between the old Mullen and the new one forming. And so it's very possible air's coming down through here, circulating, creating an environment that's going to erode away this part of the cave.
So one of the things we got out of the International Workshop of Ice Caves was some international interest, one example being Dr. Andreas Flitsch, who specializes in airflow studies in ice caves and actually even subway areas for counterterrorism type work that he does there in Europe. This is an example of him using a thermal imaging camera, a very pricey, very sensitive instrument. He's going to be bringing this now to all of our subsequent glacier cave trips and studies. It allows us to see very minor differences in cave temperatures, air temperatures, and how it affects surfaces. As one example, you see a Kestrel weather meter there shown in this small passage. This is one of our ice caves in Central Oregon, not the glacier cave. But he was showing it to us as an example of how just by holding it, you can see a massive temperature difference there from just where my hand used to be on it. The ice floor is just a little under freezing. The rock walls a little bit above freezing, and you can see how hot the unit itself is. Helps us know that we have to let these devices acclimatize inside the cave when we actually start taking valid measurements with it. Another example here is me pointing to what his camera shows to be a little yellow splotch on the viewfinder, if you can see that. We thought it was maybe a dead animal or something, but it ended up being just a few little drips of water from the ice formation you see just above my helmet there.
But the yellow indicated there was something warmer in that spot.
Maybe 1 degree, or here it is, water drip, 33.2 degrees, and the ice itself, 31.2. So super sensitive instrument, and something we hope to get a lot of new data of with our airflow studies in the glacier caves this coming summer. I believe June 20th is our next.
So that could show us where fine cracks are in the walls that we couldn't really detect, and it would show us airflow in or out in places.
Yeah, I think it's going to show us a great deal. And also, airflows travel in different directions. You may have a warm air current near the ceiling going downhill, or uphill rather, and cold air near the floor going downhill. So that's called stratodynamic flow. We hope that camera will help us see that. Dr. Roberto Anatori, pictured here, is a microbiologist, Vancouver, Washington, Clark College. And he's our lead microbiologist for Mount St. Helens and Mount Hood. He's interested in extremophile studies, astrobiological studies. The black mass you see on the right-hand side there is at the very back of Pure Imagination Cave. There's a little water stream coming out from where the ice bedrock interface flows over there at that point, and it's the only place we see this. Didn't know what it was, so he guided us through a collection of that. He was successfully able to culture a manganese oxide bacteria out of that deposits, and so there's something interesting going on between the glacier bedrock interface further upstream in the glacier. And then the upper left-hand photo you see circled in red, some peculiar little formations. They all face down tube. There's no light that we can detect with the naked eye, but apparently these guys can detect that there is a little bit of light coming from the entrance in the far, far distance. So this is an example of mineralization triggered by some kind of microbial community living there. Again, fed by the water stream just kind of flowing over the walls. So a lot more coming on this in future trips. The Mount Hood trip spawned interest in other glacier cave areas such as Mount St. Helens. This is an image of one of the caves there. One of our guides or Sherpas on Mount Hood let us know about this, so we were able to get a research permit through Mount St. Helens and conduct another week-long expedition there. Here you see these are fumarole-formed glacier caves. Lots and lots of interesting things going on in here, which we'll cover at a later date. Godzilla Caves, one of the maps that resulted from our recent expedition. This was this past June 2014. As you can see by all the question marks, there's a ton of passages yet to be explored and surveyed, so we'll be going back in 2016 to complete this giant project. Crevice Cave is another cave system up there, up on Mount St. Helens. So a lot of exciting stuff going on. A lot of it spawned, or actually all of it spawned by the initial discoveries on Mount Hood with the Sandy Glacier caves. Also this year was the first time we got into the Mount Rainier Summit Caves. For those of you that climb, you know there's a pretty complex cave system up there in the craters. So these caves are up at 14,300 feet. They were last surveyed in 1970. They've completely changed since then, so there's a push this year, actually it's going to be this August, a major expedition to map and study the interior of these very unique fumarole-formed glacier caves with a lot of, again, with a lot of international interest in them. Again, here's the map done in 1970, hasn't been mapped since, so this will be an interesting historical addition to the glacier caves up there on Mount Rainier. A different kind of caving again. We complain about some difficult approaches, but this one kind of takes the cake. It takes 2 to 3 days to get up there. You have to cross lots of crevasses, sometimes by ladders, belayed by ropes, deal with altitude sickness, extreme conditions. So it's you have to really want to get up there and do this kind of exploration. And there's a last shot of the summit. This is the west crater of Mount Rainier. You can see one of the many entrances leading into this very complex cave system down there. There's actually a wreckage of an airplane frozen inside the walls of one of these caves, which should be interesting to document next year. And again, we actually camped inside the cave because the conditions outside were so inhospitable. It was actually safer and more pleasant to camp inside the cave than out. Definitely a few degrees warmer. So, yeah, we want to thank you for joining us this evening, and here's a few contacts for us. The Oregon High Desert Grotto has actually got a little donation site on our website there. You see the website in the upper right-hand corner. These expeditions are really expensive. For the first couple of years, Brent and I funded these out of our own pockets, and it became apparent pretty quickly we were going to have to live in a cardboard box under an interstate if we kept doing that. So we've been seeking grants and sponsorship and all kinds of assistance. And the Facebook's page, as you see there, lower left-hand corner, shows a lot of our work, and the Instagram site, lots of Brent's photos. So you can keep up, you can keep track of us and what we're doing as our projects continue to develop. And I think that's it, Debbie. If you have any questions.
Okay, yeah, I have a couple of questions for you guys. One of them is, what is a cricket phone? Is that a field phone?
Well, cricket phone is a Norwegian Army field phone, similar to the phones that we used in Vietnam. They're basically, you connect them by a phone cable, and they're actually powered by sound. Your voice actually powers it, or you can enhance it with a little battery to get a ringer out of it. They're the primary means of communication for cave rescue, but up here, this was the only way we could really talk to each other in and out of the cave.
Okay, and I wondered if it was the same thing as in cave rescue.
Yes, it is.
The other one
Exactly.
is, what type of rope do you have to take up? What millimeter, what length, etc.? Is it a special type of rope?
Yeah, weight is a major consideration here, so we rarely carry anything larger than 9 millimeter. The two ropes we use mainly are, I believe it's a Sterling static HTP 9 millimeter rope. That's for our single rope technique work. When we're doing the aid ice climbing work, like you saw there, we use the Petzl 8.3 millimeter dragonfly ropes. They're all dry treated so that when they get wet, it just kind of sloughs off. It doesn't get real heavy and then subsequently freeze during the course of our climbing work.
We made the mistake of leaving one of the 9 mils in the large mullein rigged overnight, and when we went back, rockfall had cut the bottom part of it off.
Oh.
So we've always pulled our ropes out for that.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a very hard environment. It eats gear up a lot, so we pretty much have to get new ropes every year when we do these expeditions.
What is comprised in a medical hospital that you're bringing up, a portable hospital?
Oh, okay. Yeah, we always bring at least a couple of mountain paramedics, in some cases an actual ER doctor from our mountain rescue team. And so we have altitude medications. We'll bring carbon fiber, oxygen cylinders. Let's see, a gamma bag in some cases for altitude illness. You can manage barometric illnesses with that. We always carry a SCED, an OSS, hypothermic packaging. The usual array of emergency room medications for allergies, dysentery, anything like that. Because any one of those conditions, if it happens to you up there, it's catastrophic. You know, if it happens in a regular cave, you just kind of limp back to your car and you're miserable. But up there, if the weather closes you down, you can't fly anybody out. You could be up there stuck with weather 3 or 4 days, and that could be a fatal thing. So that's mainly what we have up there.
We also have one of the team members, Tom Gall, lived at the base of the mountain, and we would call in every night for a weather report, and he would be there if there was any problems. We were able to get out of the mountain since he was with search and rescue as well. It worked out really well.
How much food do you have to take with you? Any idea how much it weighs?
How much it weighs?
Yeah,
I'm not
like
sure.
And I think the question is, like, is it all freeze-dried or what do you guys?
Well, we would have a camp dinner where on the expeditions we would feed the whole group at night, and then didn't they take care of themselves for lunch and breakfast?
Yeah,
I believe?
pretty much everybody was on their own for breakfast and lunch, so there's a lot of freeze-dried meals for that. But in the interest of morale and also good, mountain health, we would provide a hot meal like macaroni and cheese, sausage. What else did we cook up there? I can't remember. All kinds of different hot. At night we have a great big pot. We go through the trouble of making a high calorie dinner to keep people, both their morale up and break the monotony of eating freeze-dried meals, which in the long term doesn't make your digestion go very well.
But one day, one of the Sherpas came up with a box full of donuts, was it?
Oh, yeah, muffins.
Muffins.
Yeah.
He brought up a box of muffins. That was quite a treat.
Yeah.
Quite unexpected.
Let's see. Another one says, any plans of going to the Antarctica?
It's actually funny that you say that. Dr. Roberto Anatori's already done one Antarctica trip in the Mount Erebus area, and since he's on our project now for Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens, he's requested that we do assist him with a Glacier Cave study project over there maybe in the 2 or 3 years. It takes a lot of time to set those up, but just this year that topic was brought up to us, and so yes, we are looking at getting out to some of the caves out there, probably in 2018 or 19.
Sounds exciting. Another one is, where do you get your team members, and do you take volunteers?
Where do we get our team? We get them from a lot of different places. So.
The main thing that we want to do is have people that have experience with glacier travel. They know how to walk in crampons. They know how to self-arrest with an ice axe, and they're used to a long trek like that with a heavy pack. And so we've gone all through the community the mountaineering club, the search and rescue people, the caving clubs, anywhere and everywhere where there's qualified people. And
yeah, it's kind of a unique combination of skill sets. There's a lot of good cavers, a lot of good mountaineers, but not that many that have both of those skill sets in combination. And so, I mean, you really need to have that. So that kind of whittles the numbers down.
Okay, another question is, what was the largest drop in the cave, and what was the most interesting feature that you found?
Well, the largest drop would be the Mullen.
The Cerebus Mullen, which when in the spring, when there's the winter snow on the top, that's going to add 12, 15 feet to the drop, which is what we did. So it could have been up to 150, 140 feet.
Yeah.
And I think for me that was the most interesting feature, one of the most interesting features on Mount Hood, because it's so unique. And when you're dropping down through something like that, it's just so amazingly beautiful. The colors of the blues and the greens and the ice, it just takes your breath away. Now, since then, the new Mullen, Eddy went up and he dropped that. Tell him what that was like.
Yeah,
Eddy.
that's 120 feet. It's like a gun barrel. It's a brand new shaft. It's maybe 6 feet across, directly vertical. A lot of wind blowing up or down depending on the time of day. But like Brent said, these vertical conduits are magnificent in that they give you a complete cross-section of the glacier, which is just really otherwise impossible to see. So as you're rappelling down or climbing up, you're seeing different layers of sediments, different ages of ice, volcanic ash. It's like a time capsule as you're rappelling kind of back in time. So it's a really special and very exciting otherworldly experience to go up and down these shafts, in addition to just being to the main boreholes. I'd agree with Brent. The Mullens are probably the most exciting feature of the caves.
And photographically, I think the winter when all of the waterfalls freeze, it's otherworldly and very interesting to just see that, to capture the essence. There's places in pure imagination you can look at 4 waterfalls frozen at a time from one spot.
All right, we have one that says, wonderful presentation, thanks a lot. I do have one question. Have you thought about using LiDAR to document changes in the cave volume of time?
LiDAR, so we've used, and then Brent can chime in too, we've used LiDAR for locating openings on the surface. I'm not sure if you're talking about ground penetrating radar versus LiDAR, but no, the answer to the question is no, we have not yet used anything other than survey to calculate the interior volumes of the caves. We did use LiDAR to locate some entrances, but that's about it, unless, Brent, you know of some other application.
Matt Skills is our LiDAR expert, and he gave me a list of leads to check out. But those openings can change so much year to year that if you're looking at a LiDAR map from 5 years ago, they may not exist, or they may be a long ways from where they're showing back then. So I don't know how we would use LiDAR effectively to measure anything, inside the cave besides the openings.
Okay, let me scroll down to the next question. Have you been able to date any deposits or ice layers? Is the data you took going to be used in any climate study? So
age dating, I believe we've got up to about 100 years on some. Basically, it's hard to. So here's a common question. People ask, how old is the ice? And Andrew Fountain mirrored that question with, how old is the water in a river? Which was an interesting concept, because it's not a static medium. It's flowing. There's new ice forming at the top, and the old ice is being melted off the bottom. So the ice gains thickness as it goes downhill, but it also dies off. So it's very hard to get an exact age of the ice. You can count layers and extrapolate up to 80 to 100 years of ice, but even though the glacier itself has been there for centuries. So it's kind of a misnomer to ask how old the ice itself is. We predict that the specimens like leaves, seeds, feathers, and such that are coming through the ice are somewhere between 60 to 100 years old. The Smithsonian has the duck feather. I don't know if they actually did an age dating.
We haven't had the finance to carbon radio date it yet.
Yeah, it takes a lot of money to do that. So that's something that we need grant funds for. The second part of your question was climate studies, and yes, Andreas Flitch specializes in climatology, and specifically as how it affects and interrelates with cave air and how the air communicates with outside air. So yes, in terms of comparing volumes lost from the inside out is being used by climatologists and glaciologists in glacier recession studies, and I think once Andreas Flitch gets his studies done this year, it's going to add another aspect to the climatology in terms of air and how it's affecting, in different, as the climate's changing, how it's affecting the rate at which ice ablates inside these caves.
Great. Right. Another question is, where can we see the PBS video documentary? And thank you for your presentation.
If you go to the on the screen here, Facebook, the Glacier Cave Explorers page on Facebook, go there and like the page, and go into the photo albums or scroll down the timeline, and there's links to every article, TV show, all the publicity on the Sandy Glacier should be found right there.
But there's OPB's got a site too. OPB.
All of that is shown here, and okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a free link. They can just click on it and watch the whole video, the whole 30-minute video.
Another person, this one for Eddy, it says, other than removal of formations and defacing cave, what is classified as a cave crime?
There's a lot of cultural resources inside of our caves, like pictographs and so forth, and Indian artifacts. Well, like one classic example, we had a group of kids go in there and graffiti the walls of the caves, and unbeknownst to them, they overwrote pictographs. And this is a huge deal. We have a lot of tribal interest. There's a special laws, Archaeological Resource Protection Act, that governs that. And we did go after them and got restitution. It's very expensive to clean up that kind of damage. So a lot of people forget that caves are also cultural sites. Cave crimes also include, like an example, people go into some of these caves with shotguns and shoot at bats. Just defecate in the cave, leave glass so other visitors can't get in there and enjoy it. Just a whole host of things like that. It's kind of like, the criminal mind has an imagination beyond what mine is. So it's been kind of illuminating and shocking to see some of the things people do, but that's why we spend a lot of time in there, because the caves they're not really renewable resources, so we try to take good care of them.
And another question is, how do I volunteer?
Is that your question, Debbie?
That's mine too, but no, there is a question. How do I volunteer? But yes, I've talked to you about that one.
Well, we do have trips coming up. Again, we're going to be doing a week-long expedition on Mount Hood this June, and then we have the Mount Rainier expedition in August. The best way would be to contact us on Facebook, and you see the site on there. Let Brent or I know that you are interested in doing so, and when you do that, maybe drop a little, I don't know, not like a resume, but maybe a couple paragraphs about some of your skill sets, what you'd bring to it. These are all wilderness areas, so we're limited in numbers of people that we can bring. We'd like to bring a lot more, but the permits stipulate limited numbers, so we have to kind of pick and choose the people that can multitask, that have the skills to move across these mediums and be safe up there. But we also need Sherpas to help move gear up and down these areas, so we do get wilderness waivers to bring more than the 12 people that are allowed sometimes. So again, check that Glacier Cave Explorers page out. Send Brent or I an email or a message saying that you're interested. Describe a little bit of your skills, and we'd be happy to contact you, because we do need the help.
So that was our very last question. Anything else you guys like to tell our audience?
Well, the Sandy Glacier expedition will be in late June.
Yeah, June 20 to
And
27.
Rainier will be August.
August 14 to 26, I believe.
And St. Helens will be next year. And I would just like to leave with a word of caution that I know it's very tempting for people to go visit the Sandy Glacier. I can understand why, but it is becoming more and more dangerous around the caves because as they are weakening, as they are falling apart, if you're not very aware and pay attention, there's a lot of potential for some serious injuries. So if you do plan to go there, go with the skill set to get there and just exercise a lot of caution because they have a lot of potential hazards right now.
Especially this, as warm as this winter has been.
You're right, yes.
It's some serious situations out here. All right. Well, thank you, Brent and Eddy, very much for spending your time. For those of you listening to our webinar and those of you who are going to download it, please make sure you go to the Facebook site and check out their information. These are some of our great cave explorers in the NSS. And thank you for donating your time to our viewers. We greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And we're going to have Brent back for Cave Rescue, and Eddy may be coming on. Eddy for Cave Rescue, and Brent may be coming on to do a presentation. He is writing a book about caves in the western United States, and he's got some really interesting information and some beautiful pictures. I'm trying to convince him to come back, so stay tuned. Look at the website. We have a lot of cave presentations coming up, and we'll be listing more as soon as we can get our firm dates. But thank you, everybody, for showing up, and cave safely. This is Debbie Spoons for CaveNet for the NSS. Have a good night.